morning! Thank you all for coming. I can't tell you how amazed I am to have standing room only in a session on security. I think that's absolutely fantastic. Maybe things are changing. When I started giving talks, we just had a row of security people in the front row. So maybe things are changing. That's fantastic. Thank you all for coming, and I'm really sorry if it's uncomfortable. I will try and be as entertaining as I can. It's always a nightmare going after Venkat, because he's funny and clever and entertaining and really experienced, but I'll do my best. My name is Eoin Woods. I realise that's not obvious if you look at how my name is written down. That's because I'm Irish originally. If you leave the E off the front and pronounce the rest as if it's English, that's pretty close. It's very nice to be in Latvia. Thank you for having me. I've never been to Latvia before, but it seems fantastic. I'm CTO at a company called Endava, who, if you're from Central Europe, you probably know us, and if you're from anywhere else, you'll never have heard of us. But we're a company that builds software for other people, and we're a lot bigger than 4,000. I don't know when I did this slide, too long ago. We're 5,500 now. I've been doing products for about 10 years, and that has influenced a lot of my thinking, particularly because I worked on secure products for a bit. And then, about now 15 years ago, I joined a big bank, and I spent about 10 years developing financial software. And then about 4 years ago now, I joined Endava, which has been the best move I've ever made. I'm a very lucky man. I'm the CTO there. How many people in this room, I know you're all developers, but how many of you develop products? Okay, and how many of you develop custom software for your own company? Yeah, about 20%. And how many of you develop custom software for some kind of client relationship? Again, about right. That's a good mix. Good, because you've all got slightly different security requirements. I'm just going to try and switch on my timer. So we're going to have a quick chat about what security is. You all know, I know, but let's just agree it. And then we're going to talk about a set of security principles that I've found to be useful over the years. Before I go too far, I need a brave person in the room. And I know who it is. It's Vitaly, because he's one of my colleagues, and he's sitting in the front. I'm from Belfast in Northern Ireland, and I normally talk too fast for native English speakers. So whenever I travel, I always say, could somebody be brave and tell me when I'm talking too fast? So that man is Vitaly this morning. You're going to put your hand up, right? Tell me when I'm talking too fast. Yeah. Thank you. So what is security? Well, we all sort of know. But why is security important? Security is our protection against three things: malice, mistakes, and mischance. Some people are bad, some people are unlucky, and some people are plain stupid. And actually, security is useful in all those cases. And the most important thing to remember about security, which I think you all know, but often business people don't, is that it's not an on or off thing. You don't buy a security product and plug it in the side and be secure. In fact, that's probably the worst thing you can do. Security is a business of managing a set of risks. As I can't remember his name now, an American politician used to say, we have known unknowns and unknown unknowns. And the risks are about both sorts, which makes it quite difficult. But most of the risks are about a loss of some sort. Might be money, that's the obvious one. But it could also be time. That's fundamentally what a denial of service attack tends to be. It takes an organization's attention off one thing and puts it on another. You may remember there have been some very high-profile interruption-type attacks, such as the one Maersk suffered in the last year. And they obviously stole a huge amount of time from the company, rather than actually causing a direct theft of anything tangible. Could be a loss of privacy. How many people here have a British Airways frequent flyer account? Yes, congratulations, your personal details are now well known to the internet. That's a loss of privacy. Could be a loss of reputation. And I used to work for a large Swiss banking organisation. We were very concerned about reputation, and rightly so, because reputation was one of the reasons that insanely wealthy people gave us their money to manage. So we often made that trade-off. Is this going to cost money, or would it damage reputation? We'll spend the money. And also advantage. For situations where there's competition, such as bidding, security can be the business of making sure that process cannot be unfairly interrupted. So think of it as a kind of insurance. You do security because you're trying to balance the costs of that against the risks you think you face. And that's a model I use with both technical managers and business managers all the time. I always say, do you pay your insurance? And they all go, yes. Well, in that case, if you think you've got security risks, think of it in the same way. It's like an insurance policy. There's a lot of security, though. Good grief, is it a big field? I keep discovering bits I know nothing about. And there's some little bits I do know about. A lot of people think about the mustard-coloured blocks on the right-hand side. That security is basically about the infrastructure, right? I've got firewalls, and I've got an intrusion detection system, so I think we're just about done. And that's secure infrastructure design. And then they deploy it in a really shabby way and never patch it. So then they're insecure anyway. So that's secure infrastructure deployment. But I don't know much about that. Colleagues and friends who are real experts in it, so I know I don't know much about it because they do. The thing that I know more about is secure applications. There's been a tendency historically to worry about making the infrastructure, set to the operating system level, highly secure, and then just assume the applications would sort of be okay because they were in secure boxes. And given the number of data exfiltration attacks, that's when my ba.com details got posted to the internet, that view has thankfully gone out of fashion. We now realise we need a high degree of security in applications as well. And just the same, obviously, there's a design aspect and an implementation aspect. And underpinning it all is operating your system securely. So that's the map. That's what we need to know. I've got some good news and some bad news. The bad news is my principles don't cover all of that. The good news is they do cover a bit of it. They cover secure application design. So today I'm not going to talk about secure implementation. It's a big topic all by itself. And I'm not really going to talk about infrastructure, or for that matter, operation. But I think most of you do applications. So I think we're all safe. I think we're talking about the right thing. So if we need any motivation, there are many indicators as to why the topic of security is getting more important. Certainly, one of them is the fact that who here is involved in a digital project with a big D? Oh, the rest of you are lying. Put your hands up. We're all in a digital project now. I mean, everyone's got a digital project. And what is a digital project? Well, it tends to be taking interactions, processes that used to be manual or completely human-based, and digitizing them, as in computerizing them. Doesn't really sound very exciting when you say it that way, does it? Sounds like what we've done for 40 years, but apparently it's now called digital, so it's completely different. It certainly costs more, if you talk to a consultancy anyway. And what happens in most digital projects? Well, people want to do new and exciting things because they now have automated processes, and a side effect of that is, you know that system that when they built, you asked questions about security, and they said, don't worry too much, it's never going to be connected outside the company. What happens in a digital project? Everyone goes, oh, that system, we could connect it outside the company. Give customers self-service. How exciting would that be? Well, actually, exciting in unexpected ways, it turned out. Exciting because when you connect to the internet, it's very empowering because you connect to potentially people all over the world. And your marketing group are very, very excited about that. Turns out your CISO is tremendously less excited about that because they're thinking about different people. Marketing are thinking about people who've got credit cards. I know that's not very selective, but that's basically their bar. Are they going to spend money? The CISO's thinking about people in faraway places with too much time on their hands who are unusually inquisitive. And there's quite a few of those too. And so what we've managed to do is we've taken internal systems that we thought security wasn't a big deal, and we've directly connected them to people in unnamed countries like China, where there are professionals who are trained to break into other people's systems. And that's why the landscape, what we call the threat landscape, has changed fundamentally over the last 10 years. There's a very interesting website called Information is Beautiful, and it's not about security. They visualize all kinds of data. It's really a demo for how you go about visualizing things on the web. And they have a data set which reveals data breaches over a number of years. And if you go back to 2005 kind of era, it wasn't good, but there weren't that many significant data breaches. I mean, each of these is people's lives being ruined, so I wouldn't want to trivialize it, but at least there's a lot of white space. And then we started connecting systems to the internet, perhaps unwisely, and this happened. The white started disappearing, and the bubbles got bigger. The bubbles is the severity of the incident. You can see the British National Health Service got its name in the roll of dishonour about this period. So this was up to about 2011, so still some years ago. Anyone got any idea what the graph looks like today? How much white do you think there is on it today? Yeah, precisely none. Yeah, well, not quite none. Actually, because of the rendering algorithm, you get little bits of white, but they shouldn't really be there. That's only the rendering algorithm. You can see, and now Sweden's got in on the act, except it was the transport agency, not the Swedish health system. Congratulations. Really big ones in Britain's Carphone Warehouse, Equifax, BA is where I noticed last night is somewhere on here. Oh, it's moved. It's a dynamic thing, so when you screenshot it, the bubbles move. Mossack Fonseca, that revealed where lots of politicians keep lots of money they shouldn't have. All kinds of data breaches. But the point is, the world has changed. It's not that systems have become less secure. It's that the threat, in fact, they're probably better than they were back then, unbelievably. It's that the threat landscape is fundamentally different, and that's why security is now everybody's business. That's why we're talking about security principles. So what is a principle? Everyone sort of knows what it is, but it's everyone's got a slightly different idea. For our purposes, there's a number of definitions, but it's a fundamental truth, or really a proposition. It's a statement we're going to make that serves as a foundation for something you believe or something you do. For security, obviously, what that means is it's a statement to guide security design. So we're looking not for a set of security design decisions, because they're too specific. We're looking for a set of guidelines to help us make good security design decisions, and that's what these principles are. When I started looking at design principles, I did this when I was in banking. I guess roughly the time Nick Rosansky and I wrote our book, and a little bit beyond, because I was quite involved at a large bank in helping to make a large number of applications more secure. And we started to think about design principles. I discovered there's quite a few sets. The nice thing about standard, there are so many to choose from. Some of them are quite small. If you've come across Gary Viega, and is it Cliff McGraw, I think? They wrote a set quite some years ago now, which is very good. There's 10. Who's come across OWASP? Because I think they're quite strong in the Nordics and the Baltics. Yeah, some people. Okay, if you haven't heard of OWASP, go and Google that afterwards. They have a well-known set, which is 10. And then NIST is a US government organisation. Being the government, they thought they should have 30. And then the British government came up with a set and said, well, anything the Americans can do, so we've got 45-ish. And then somebody who must be on the edge of insanity in Canada, a guy called Cliff Burke, has got the most comprehensive set. He's got 185. So I don't think that's very useful, because I can't remember a dozen things, never mind 185, but you've got to admire how thorough he's been. The thing was, when I came to look at these sets, I found there's actually some fundamentals run across them all. They're saying the same thing in different ways, and that's a bit confusing. So I distilled out these 10 key principles, and that's the point I'm trying to draw your attention to. This isn't my genius. I haven't got any genius, so that would be a short discussion. But it isn't me saying these are the right principles. This is me synthesizing the work of the security community, but trying to make it a bit more accessible. Because when you pick up security principles, it's not always obvious what they mean. We need a demo system, very, very briefly. A system to be secured, you've got to have a toy system. This is my toy system. There's a small army of people who clearly do a boring and repetitive job because they're all wearing the same shirt and tie. There's a person who's kind of close to them who must be more senior because rather than purple, he's got a red tie. And he's some kind of manager, supervisor. There's somebody who, you'll note, figuratively and metaphorically, is quite a long way from them. He's completely different because he's got a blue tie. So therefore, he's a senior manager. It is coincidence that the senior manager matches the firewall. I've only just noticed that. There's some kind of networking hardware that provides some kind of security on the perimeter, so we'll call that firewall. There is some kind of web request handling tier. That's probably your standard web server tier. There are a couple of large processing systems in the back. When I first drew this, those were probably very large stacked kind of maybe Solaris or Linux machines. Think of them as a Kubernetes cluster. And then they have some shared data source, which they're all sharing. And the sparkly ball indicates that that's outside the organization. That's a service that they call. So I need all these characteristics for the different principles. So it's different kinds of people, perimeter security, request handling tier, main process systems, shared data, and sparkly ball outside the system. So what are our principles? I'm not going to read them. This is the contents page. But they are all, I think, ones that you will recognize. I'm sure everyone here will recognize at least 2 or 3 just from what people have said before. But the important thing is that we actually read them, understand them, and use them. Because it's a bit like the OWASP Top 10. Have you come across the web app OWASP Top 10? That's a list of the 10 most common vulnerabilities found in web-based systems. And it's done by data analysis every 3-4 years by the OWASP organization. Anyone hazard a guess at the most common kind of web security problem that they keep seeing? Humans. All of these are technical, but that's a really good point. People are always the weak link. Injection attacks. Thank you, yeah. Now, who here doesn't know about SQL injection? You all know about SQL injection, and yet it's the most common thing we see in systems. So it's the same with these. I think you'll have seen them before, but the reason we go over them is to remind ourselves how important they are. So number 1 is least privilege. The problem with many computer system security models is that they allow quite broad privileges to people. So the classic thing would be running all of your servers as root, because it's a very easy thing to do. And the problem with broad privilege is that if there is some kind of problem with security, such as accidental or malicious access to the system, people can now access a very broad range of resources inside the system. So the principle is to limit the privileges to the minimum you can. The problem is, why don't we just do this? Well, we don't just do it because there's a trade-off. Every principle's got a trade-off. As soon as you start limiting principles, they're quite a lot less convenient. It's quite a lot less efficient, and it adds quite a lot of complexity. So the classic example would be, for every server process you've got, you create a security principle, or a user in normal speak, for it, and you give it just the access privileges it needs, and nothing more. And how convenient is that? Not terribly convenient, typically, because all of those principles now need managed. It's another thing to get wrong, and it's a thing that when something goes wrong in production, makes it more difficult to diagnose a problem. So it's none of the principles. It's important to be upfront about this. None of these come for free. There's a tendency for us to go, just do the following 10 things. That's a classic thing management consultants do, because they don't need to do them. They just hand over the PowerPoint and then leaving the bill on the table. When you actually come to do them, any action, typically, has got some kind of a trade-off. And least privilege is one of those. The other related principle is to make sure you separate responsibilities as much as possible. There is a tendency, again, in application systems to just treat users as users and not to have very many kinds of user inside the system. In contrast, if you look at operating systems, they probably take it to quite extreme degrees. They typically have dozens of roles that can be managed individually. The point of separating responsibilities is, one, you achieve more control, but secondly, you can have more accountability because people only have the access to do what they're allowed to do. And should somebody compromise the system, because as somebody in the front row pointed out very, very wisely, the weakest link in many systems are the people. How many of you have ever been in an incident involving password guessing? Most security people have. There's a tremendous number of problems with weak passwords. However, when somebody guesses one password, you want to limit the scope, or the domain in security speak, that they can then access. And that's one of the major reasons you separate responsibility. So you compartmentalize things. It's a similar sort of trade-off to least privilege, though. It complicates things. So how do you typically do this sort of separation inside the system? What do you use as a security thing you use? A role. Yep. Role-based access control. Is that quite familiar? You've been using role-based access control since you were graduates, right? And when you come to design role-based access control for your systems, how do you do it? Well, quite often what you do is you use a role-based access control grid, which is just a table with roles down one side, privileges along the other, and you do the ticks and the crosses, don't you? And how well does that work for 4 roles? Really quite well, typically. How well does it work for 80 roles? Really, really badly. Because now you can't be sure if you've got a consistent set of roles. I was involved in a big, not exactly a rewrite of the system, but a major system saving job at a big bank. And we had a very complicated and very poorly thought out role-based access control system implemented in the application, which in itself was not a bad thing to do. And there was lots of custom code all over the app going, if it's this role and it's not Bob, or if it's this role and they're not in Switzerland, and if it's this role and they're not in Asia. It was just horrible. So and there were lots of bugs in it. They were always discovering. Audit were really worried about it, and there were lots and lots of bugs being raised about, I can't do this and I should, and lots of other bugs that they didn't tell us about, which is, I shouldn't be able to do this, but I can. They never tell you about those. Have you noticed that? They're quick to get on the phone when they can't do something, but when they discover they can manipulate something they shouldn't, they're rather slow to tell you. So we started working on this. We did all the right things, or so we thought. We engaged people, because it was a global system, so 3 regions, engaged people from all the different kinds of user group, engaged all the different regions, spent quite a long time working out what the model was, ran workshops with them, tried to understand how they worked. Of course, there was a UAT period. And what happens in UAT? Precisely nothing, as all UATs. They looked at it and kind of went, it'll be fine. So after that deep involvement, we then went to production. And it was random. It was sort of poetic justice. I was the senior technical person at the top of the call tree that night. And I was going to bed at my normal time, sort of 11 o'clock. I just sort of thought to myself, I wonder if we're going to get a call tonight. I have a bad feeling. 3 o'clock in the morning, my phone goes off. And luckily, we had outstanding support engineers who already had figured it out. So a guy called Andre, who happened to be in Krakow in Poland, called me and kind of went, I'm really sorry, I went to get you out of bed, but we've got a serious one. I went, is it to do with the security? He went, funny you should mention that. Yeah, it's to do with the security. So I get on the phone to this guy in Hong Kong, it would have been, and we have this conversation, and he'd been heavily involved in the process. Not a surprise to him, he led one of the workshops. And he said, I'm really disappointed this has gone wrong after all the hard work. I said, not as disappointed as I am. It's 3 o'clock in the morning. So what's wrong? And he said, well, I can't release this trade. Some trader got stuck and he couldn't release. I can't release this trade. I thought, well, that's right, isn't it? You're not meant to be able to release that trade. Well, he said, except I need to. I'm special. I've always got more than one role. We had gone through this process and absolutely nailed down that they couldn't have overlapping roles. And yet, we had the whole grid, and we worked the whole thing through with them. We ran scenarios, and they were absolutely convinced that they had to simplify the model until they actually came to do it for real. And unfortunately, early his day, very early my day, he realized that actually he'd been lying all along. And that's quite common with role-based access control. It's more than a couple of roles. So there is quite a big trade-off in compartmentalizing securely, which is what any security engineer will tell you. You have lots and lots of compartments, versus actually making it work for real in production. So what did we do? Put a patch into the code for his user ID, put it into production, and he got working for the rest of the day. Obviously, we then backed that fix out a few minutes later, but it was a great lesson in, as you bring in more sophistication into the security model, most people don't understand it. And also that users are quite difficult to deal with. but you knew that already. So in our system, if you were separating responsibilities, what you might... check my build. What you might well be doing is that right through the domain-specific parts of the system, you might be having different security domains, so different sets of roles, probably roles. In this case, of course, it's really easy because there's only 3, so it looks kind of obvious. You've probably got orders, payments, and customer service, or something like that. The thing that is worth noting, though, is that we don't just create a few application roles in here and be done with it. We make sure that all the resources in the system are controlled that way, because then we're less likely to have some kind of mistake where we allow the payments administrators to access sensitive customer data by mistake. Because in the database, we've got database level control too. Better keep moving, actually. Be careful who you trust. There are many principles about them, but they basically boil into be careful who you trust. Who is that person? What was that? Very good. He's a stock photography actor. The only reason, of course, you all said that is we're in a session talking about security. If you saw that man on television, or if your mum saw that man on television, or your dad, what would they think? They'd probably think they were a doctor. That's very reasonable. One, he looks very trustworthy and he has a nice smile. He's got a white coat on. What more evidence do you need? And he's got a stethoscope. Really, I mean, that's practically proof he's a doctor. And that's the kind of thinking that we all fall into all the time. How many of your TLS connections have got certificates at both ends? Roughly. A few. It's not all that common. So we do trust things quite implicitly. How many of you trust a DNS server? Well, we have to trust a DNS server, right? I mean, you don't have much option. So we do trust a lot of things quite implicitly. In fact, if you're a security engineer, you will know that that's one of the biggest problems in security. An awful lot of security problems are caused by inserting something which is malicious into a connection between two things that trust each other. So classically, that's the man-in-the-middle attack. But it doesn't just happen with web requests across the internet. How many of you use open source in your systems? You're all going to put your hands up if you're listening, because everyone uses open source in their systems, apart from people who are maybe, I don't know if submarine control systems use open source, but actually I suspect they probably do these days. So open source, what are you doing with open source? What does my first sentence say? You are inserting an untrusted piece of code in between two other things that you are assuming you can trust. I'm not saying you shouldn't do it. I mean, we do it, but the point is to be cautious when you do it if you are concerned about security. So the general principle is, if you don't know that you can trust an entity in your system, don't trust it. Assume that it can be compromised. The trade-off here, if you get above the level of open source, but even with open source components, is trusting things implicitly is much, much easier than setting up trust conditions between things. So if you're thinking about network endpoints, the reason you don't use certificates at both ends of TLS is because you get an explosion in the number of certificates to manage. And also, it's sometimes hard to get them on all the devices. That's a perfectly practical problem, but that doesn't mean it's necessarily a good thing to do from a security perspective. You also probably get development overhead. For example, you scan all your open source. That's actually something we're trying to encourage really strongly at Endava. What fascinates me is we've bought the software, so it's there for teams to use. How many clients tell us not to bother doing it because it's going to take some time? You go, yes, but compared to not finding a problem, it might save a lot of time. And it's one of these insurance policy things. But a lot of people don't really think that way. So in our system, we could ask some questions like, who are those users? How do we know? Oh, one of the users has disappeared. That was the slightly senior, but not very senior, red tie. How do we know those people are who they are? There's a large bank. It's not one actually I've worked for. I've been there as a consultant, where they have made a very large investment in smart card technology. And it's a bit of a pain. That's one of those classic security trade-offs of ease of use. If you forget your smart card, you can't log on to their systems. On the other hand, it really increases security because smart cards are attached to the people. So when the people walk away from their desks, if they forget to lock their screens, removing their smart card has the same effect. It locks their screens. And know who's attaching to their networks. So they've got something the people know, their password, and something the people have, their security tokens. So they put a big investment into that and made it work really well. Similarly, there's quite a lot of major internet companies now are investing in two-factor authentication to try and increase the understanding we have of who it is that's connecting to us. You've then got a lot of probably very sensitive services running in the middle tier. What's connecting to them? If something gets compromised in this part of the system, are you sure who's connecting to you? The answer in most applications that I come across is no. We have absolutely no idea who's connecting to us. Anybody who sends us a valid network stream will get their request handled. And if they can fake a security token, they're in. Absolutely no problems. When we're looking at the middle tier, what libraries do we have in our stack? Who uses Node.js? How many libraries have you got in your application? You have no idea, do you? You're bluffing. But it's a large number. And the Java people can't be too smug either. Because who uses Gradle or Maven? Yeah, quite a few, yeah. And what happens when you type Bill the first time? You go to coffee, don't you? Because it's not pulling in what you asked for. It's putting in what you need. That's a completely different ballgame. So there's all the transitive dependencies. So actually, we're pulling in very large amounts of stuff. I don't actually remember. I know I'm kicking myself because I should have gone to look it up. A few days ago, there has been a really serious potential security vulnerability in a JavaScript library. Somebody here, I'm sure, knows the name, which is pulled in by lots of well-known JavaScript. Which one? EventStream, that's it. Thank you very much. Yes. So EventStream, which, as it happens, a lot of us have ended up with kind of by mistake. Then do we know what we're connecting to? For some systems, like if you send payments on the Swift network, that's pretty obvious. You do know who you're connecting to. They take that really, really seriously. Other things, we use network-connected services. Do we know where the data's going? Maybe, but maybe not. And then finally, the database tends to have the crown jewels. You will remember the diagram that showed things are getting worse with the bigger bubbles. That's all come out of databases. Well, pretty well. To the first approximation, it's all out of databases. So what can connect to our database? Some organizations I've worked in do take this really seriously. And this is a separate security realm, really. And then this is surrounded by its own security layer. And how easy is that to work with? Not at all. So again, it's the trade-off about all of these steps sound sensible, but as developers, architects, designers, we've got to keep in the back of our heads, all of them come with a cost. And that's where we need to be thinking about this insurance policy model. Fourth thing is do the simplest thing possible, which is good in so many different ways. The quote at the top is actually not about security. It's about reliability, but it's in exactly the same area. It's Professor Tony Hoare, who's one of my professional heroes. And Tony Hoare was a professor at Queen's University Belfast and then at Cambridge, I think, and then he was with Microsoft Cambridge. In fact, he still is with Microsoft Cambridge. He's still with us. He spent most of his career trying to work out how to make software systems suck less, to steal Venkat's title, and in particular how to make them reliable. And he's quite a funny guy, actually. He's very, very humble and transparent considering his achievements. But as he says, he spent 30 years solving the wrong problem. Because he spent 30 years looking at mathematical methods. Did anyone study CSP at university? Is anyone old enough to have studied CSP? Which is a very well-known concurrency modeling technique among formalists. That was Tony Hoare's work. So he solved, as he says now, he's completely open about it, he solved the wrong problem for 30 years. But now at Microsoft Research, he's been looking at how you solve it using conventional code tools. And his conclusion, after decades, was the best thing you can do to improve your reliability is what? Increase your simplicity, meaning take out the complexity. Security is exactly the same. Bruce Schneier has a great quote. Bruce Schneier is a luminary in the security community. He's inventor of the Two-Fish, I think it is, cryptography protocol, for example, but very, very well-known guy. And he always says, if you cannot understand it, you cannot secure it. And what were we saying in Venkat's talk earlier about do you understand everything that's inside your systems? And that's why he used the Tony Hall quote too. There's two ways of making sure that it's got no defects. You make it so complex, it's got no obvious defects, or you make it so simple, it's obviously got no defects. Same thing for security. If we layer complexity on complexity on complexity, it's very difficult to know the security implications. And this is something that worries me quite a bit, and has since J2EE came along, really. Do you remember J2EE? This huge stack of tottering middleware that nobody quite understood how the bits fitted together, but they knew where to insert their code, kind of, and we sort of fiddled with it till it worked, which is exactly the opposite of achieving a secure system. So we need to actively design for simplicity. Doesn't that sound simple? All you've got to do is design for simplicity. And what's that in direct conflict with? Everything every stakeholder is asking you to do. Has your product owner ever said, this is getting a bit complex, should we take a few features out? Have they ever said that to you? Because they've never said it to me. They've always gone, I've got a huge list of features and I'd like them all this sprint. They've never said, oh, very complicated, we should definitely do less. So it sounds easy, and actually it's very difficult. So you need to make hard decisions on features, and also how sophisticated. My example of this is a team I came across, not within my current employer, a previous one, who had clearly been bored because they needed a configuration system. So rather than just use Springs, they realized they could do something a lot cleverer because they'd just learnt Groovy over Christmas. So what do you think they did? What's Groovy really good at? Complex DSLs. Have a guess how they did configuration in their system. Really complicated DSL with side effects. It was very clever. At no point did I challenge its cleverness, but it was a security nightmare because you just had no idea what was going to end up at the end of the configuration process, and the ability to put in a side effect by changing some bit of Groovy was absolutely everywhere. That, I agree, is a slightly extreme example I used to make a point, but there's lots of complexity in your systems that probably has some effect on security. Number 5, audit sensitive events. The reason is, if we know what's happened when something bad goes on, then we can understand the implications, and we know how to react, and we can avoid it in the future. If we can spot what's going on before it becomes bad, then we've got a chance of avoiding it completely. The key principle is that you have lots of security sensitive stuff in your system. Tell your system what's going on in it in a tamper-resistant store. The tricky bit is typically the tamper-resistant store bit. Putting stuff in a tamper-resistant store is harder than it sounds, because nearly all data stores are designed to be mutable. This isn't a good reason to use a blockchain, by the way, if anyone was having that thought. Blockchains don't make good audit logs, but it's actually some of those characteristics of append only that you really need to build, which does add a certain degree of complexity. So the classic example inside systems is you've got core business entities that are important to your system. Write all of the changes to them to an append-only store, so you know who did it, when they did it, and what the impact was. And so in our system, we would simply create another data store. I mean, I've used a clever, cute little icon to make it look like a totally different kind of database. In reality, you probably have to build it using a conventional database. So that's a question probably of having a separate database security domain. So if you break into the database, you can't wipe the audit store. And then configuring it very carefully, so make it as close to an append-only store as you can. You're halfway there. Look on the bright side. And I need to move a bit faster. So assign least privilege, separate your responsibilities, trust carefully, you do the simplest thing possible, and audit whatever happens. Number 6 is about making sure that things are secure by default. So many of you here, I'm sure, will have used Oracle. Do you remember Oracle until a few releases ago? What happened when you installed it? How many logins did you get with well-known passwords? It was like 6 or 8, including Scott Tiger and System and Manager, and all of those really sensitive accounts were installed with well-known passwords. Do any of you use a well-known document database that if you install it without changing the security model, is completely open? You know which one I'm talking about. I'm on video, I'm not going to name it. However, if you security researchers routinely scan the internet and discover a certain document origin database completely open with live information in it, that's a very good example of not having a secure default. And I don't really understand in this day and age why it comes out of the box like that. Although, to be fair, I haven't looked at it for a year. Maybe they've changed it. The other thing is that when you're designing systems, make sure that if they fail, they stay secure. Classic example of this is around auditing. When I worked for Sybase, this is some years ago, so I can name them, we built auditing into the product. But Sybase was characterized by being non-stop, very high performance. And those were the characteristics we always tried to protect. So what do you think the first release of the server did when the audit log filled up? Switched off auditing and just carried on at full speed. It did log a security event saying I've switched off auditing, but it just continued. We shipped it off to a client in beta. It was a large American bank who kind of called us and went, "We've discovered a really serious bug. It switches auditing off." No, our security team said, that's so we don't interrupt service. We deliberately switch it off. The bank went, "You kind of missed the point. If we fill the audit log, that's probably an attack. We'd like you to stop the database." And so that obviously that behavior was flipped before we went to GA. But there are lots of situations where systems fail in a way where actually they fail in a way that's relatively insecure. Number 7 is the mistake that every security designer has done at some point. It can be nicknamed as "they'll never guess that," except they will, especially if you're connected to a lot of people in China with time on their hands. You can be pretty sure they'll guess anything you think they won't. Hiding things is difficult. There's 2 ways that people come across things. One, they're performing a systematic attack on your system, or they just trip across it. And the more people that happen to connect to your system having a poke around, the more likely it is someone's going to trip across it. Never mind you attract the unwelcome attention of a nation state. If you attract the unwelcome attention of a nation state, kind of all bets are off anyway. But with enough people looking at your system, hiding things is very difficult. So there is a security principle which has been in place for decades, actually. Military systems were the first, I think, to think of this, which is assume your attacker's got perfect knowledge if your system's secure. If the answer is no, then you are not secure. If the answer is yes, then by all means obfuscate anything you like, because there's no harm adding obfuscation. It doesn't necessarily do any damage. It doesn't cause a problem, but never rely on it, and that's the point. So, for example, if you use port knocking to protect your SSH ports on your machines, don't assume that no one's going to guess your port knock sequence. So port knocking is where you require people to attach to other ports briefly before attaching to the target port. Someone's going to trip across it someday, or someone's going to read it out of the config file. So that knowledge is not going to be enough to keep your system entirely secure. On the other hand, it's useful to prevent simple scanning attacks. So that's an example where obscurity is useful, but not sufficient. Number 8, everyone's heard of, and we typically then hear it, acknowledge it, and just move on. It's defense in depth. Defense in depth is the idea that you don't want to have one point of security. You cannot afford to have one mechanism to stop an attacker getting into your system. And why is that? Because systems do get attacked. The data we saw at the start proves that. Mistakes happen. People configure things wrongly. So if we have a single, for example, a single outer boundary, and that's the only security mechanism in our system, it will get breached someday. So the question to always ask yourself is, when one of my major mechanisms gets breached, what happens then? And this is the idea behind more recent thinking in zero trust networking. What those guys are saying is, your network has been breached, get over it. What are you going to do? Whereas historically, and certainly the environments I've worked in, there's been an assumption that if we have a hard perimeter, and that's kept really, really secure, we don't need to worry too much about the security inside it. Because actually, especially in today's world, that's 180 degrees wrong. We actually need to be thinking, we have been breached. What controls do we have inside the network now? So to give you a tangible example, who here uses messaging in their systems? Fair number? I'm surprised not more. Okay, so a fair number. How many of you encrypt the messages as they flow between the systems? Less hands. Should we just say that and move on? Less hands. So therefore, if somebody has access to your network, they have access to all of your business data eventually, because it's all going to end up flowing across a message bus. So secure at different levels. So in our system here, we really have lost that chap at the top. Obviously, we've got a firewall, and that's brilliant, and we need to have a firewall, but we also need to make sure that our web request tier is as secure as possible. So, for example, we harden Linux. We take all the dev tools off it. We take all the utilities we don't need off it. If you're slightly in for a good time, you use a secure version of Linux. You make it as secure as possible, but you still assume that's going to get attacked. So then we make sure we have effective security controls in the main processing tier. And beyond that, the database is in its own security realm. And even within the database, we have access control, meaning that even if you break into the database as a regular user, parts of the database are off limits to you. The ninth, you are very nearly there. Look on the end is in sight. The ninth principle is don't invent your own security technology. Every security engineer has invented their own bit of security technology, just for nothing else. And that's fine. You learn a lot doing it. You learn how hard it is. The key thing is don't put it in production. Most security engineers don't like new stuff when it comes to security technology. That's because most of them have the experience that as soon as a new piece of security technology is shipped, it's broken. And that's because it's very hard to create secure software. Therefore, if people who do this for a living can't do it, we can't. They find it hard, we just can't do it. So creating security technology is really quite a big problem. So there's two principles really wrapped up in one, which is reuse third-party security technology from respectable sources, and two, don't use brand new security stuff when it just comes out. So most security engineers will tell you the brand new stuff will have vulnerabilities in it. So clearly, don't create your own single sign-on mechanism. Create your own secret storage. Don't write your own crypto library. I'm sure nobody will write a crypto library, but I worked for a bank that created its own single sign-on mechanism, and after a number of years in production, a really significant vulnerability was found in it. Now, we have no idea whether that caused problems, but it's just the fact that that wasn't a group of developers having a go. That was a corporate security engineering team working with third parties, and they still managed to put a vulnerability into it. So in our case, for example, if we've rather than hashing our passwords inside our properties files, let's take our secrets and put them somewhere safe, written by people who know how to create secret stores. That happens to be HashiCorp Vault, but there are a number of technologies to keep secrets safe, especially clouds, for example, all have their own secret stores. So use them. And my last one is secure the weakest link. This actually is my summary of security, which is secure the weakest link. The principle is to keep on finding the weakest link in your security chain, make it more secure, and then go and find the next one. That's how you stay secure, not by doing security and moving on. It needs to be a continual process of finding out what the next problem is, and it's just the same as many of you will have done lots of performance engineering. And what do you do with performance engineering? You find the next bottleneck, and then you find the one after that, and the one after that. Just the same with security. Find the weakest link in your security chain, and remember it can be people, their processes, or the technology. Find the weakest link, make it stronger, and move on. I call this the paper wall problem, which I'm absolutely sure a security engineer taught me this phrase years ago, but I gave this talk in London about a year ago, and a bright guy from ThoughtWorks emailed me afterwards and said, that paper wall thing, it's a really useful analogy. Where did you get it? And I said, it's just Google it, it'll be fine. And he came back after and went, no, I've really Googled it, and I can't find it. I also searched the academic literature for it, but actually I can't find it. So maybe it was a thing that Intertrust, who were a security engineering firm I used to work for, maybe we invented it. But if so, it was completely accidental. The paper wall problem is an analogy of, imagine you have a castle with 4 walls. There's very little point making the portcullis bigger and stronger if the back of the castle is made of paper. Many security systems suffer from this. They have very, very secure parts, with small, very insecure parts. And you can be absolutely sure that attackers will find the latter. So this is fundamentally security. Understand what your threat is, find your vulnerabilities, fix them, repeat. And the term for that process really is threat modeling. Anyone here do threat modeling? No. Google threat modeling, Google Microsoft threat modeling, give it a go. It's a lot easier than it sounds, and it is the technique for figuring out what you need to do next with your security. So to recap, we've got 10 principles which will keep us more secure if only we could remember them and apply them. And that's the difficult bit, applying them, because they all have trade-offs. We want to assign the least privilege possible and separate responsibilities in our system, so to create security containers. We need to be very careful about what we trust about when we import into our system or when we connect things together. And we always need to go for the simplest thing possible, because there's some chance of securing. There's no chance of securing the most complicated things. Bad things are going to happen, so we need to audit what's going on so we know what's happening, and it needs to be in a tamper-resistant store. And we need to make sure we've got secure defaults and we fail securely so that when the system goes wrong, it doesn't immediately become insecure. Obscurity is not a bad thing in itself, but we must never rely on it. Always assume that an attacker has perfect knowledge of your system, that they understand what's under the doormat. And implement defense in depth, because your security mechanisms will be broken. They may even be broken already. So make sure you've got multiple levels of security, especially around your most sensitive assets. Security technology is really hard to build. People make mistakes doing it all the time. So don't be one of those people. Don't build it, reuse it. And finally, security is all about a continuous process. Find your weakest link, make it stronger, repeat. And I'm afraid that process never ends, which is great news if you love security, and I realise considerably less good news if you don't. But I'm afraid that's the reality. It's an ever-changing landscape, and you will always have to keep improving. There's some references I will leave you to enjoy at your leisure, and a few books. I'll just draw your attention to the one called Threat Modeling by Adam Shostak. He was the guy who introduced threat modeling to Microsoft. If you can introduce threat modeling to Microsoft as they were 10, 12 years ago, you can do it anywhere. And it's a very practical book that really takes away a lot of the mystique that security people like to wrap around threat modeling. So if I've got to pick one of those, that's a great one to go and read next. Thank you. I'm just about out of time, but thank you very much for your attention.
Yeah, we are kind of out of time, but I think we could try to answer the questions quickly. There are just few.
Okay.
What do you think of unikernels? Are they future of security?
I'm not sure they're the future of security, because I think they come with trade-offs like all the other things. I think they're a really useful example of separating responsibilities. They create security compartments which you can't break out. Well, can't. They're more difficult to break out of, and that's really useful.
And the next one is there anything that doesn't rely on obscurity, like its username plus password or secret in general, kind of obscurity, how to apply your principle there? So for the 7th principle.
Yeah, so I suppose, so not relying on obscurity would be to have very long, difficult to guess usernames and no password. The password isn't obscure, it's a secret. So that's a different thing. An obscured thing is something there where you're simply trying to hide something. So if you could imagine a system that had 30-character usernames randomly allocated, those would be hard to guess. But to use them without a password would be very unwise. So that's the difference between obscurity and having an actual secret.
Yeah, and last would be about the slides. Would you publish them somewhere? Because we find one link, but I'm not sure if it's up to date.
Yeah, definitely. So they should be on Speaker Deck. I will replace, and they're not up to date, so I will replace the version on Speaker Deck with these. If you DM me on Twitter, or I'm very easy to find, I'm owen.woods@indava.com. If you drop me a note, I will gladly send them to you.
Okay, thank you very much. Guys, people try to find him around and speak if you want.
I'm here for the rest of the day.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.